All right, as promised, I'm going to walk through the lesson plan assignment so that you have an idea of what to do if you would like to submit a draft. As I noted earlier on the course outline, I took out the assessment project and added in an optional, again optional, opportunity for you to submit your large and or small group lesson plans in a draft form to get feedback without it being graded. So that draft would be due, I believe it's February 26th. So you can get some feedback and use that for your final version of your lesson plans, which is due on March 5th. All right, so if we head over to the ReggieNet site and we open up, these two look exactly the same, the draft and the lesson plan. The same attachments are there. I put everything into the draft just so that you have everything at your fingertips. But again, submit only your draft here, your final at the other place. So I've gone ahead and opened up these. I don't know why it saves these in this order. I would actually look at the checklist and guidelines first, then the template, then the example. But anyway, they're all there for you to access in ReggieNet. So something I wanted to point out first, I'm going to go to the template. This is the blank template that you can use to submit, to put in the information that you need into your large group and small group lesson plans. What I wanted to note here quickly is that these pretty much look identical. The large group, and then I'm going to scroll really fast down to the small group. All right, so the information that you'll include is obviously going to be different, but the actual template itself is pretty much the same. As a reminder, I think I've mentioned this, but just to refresh your memory, for the small group lesson, you'll be using your higher level lesson objective that you created for the Standards and Objectives project. A small group lesson should be a lesson that's led by you as a teacher, that has no more than 5 students, and it should reinforce what you've taught in your large group lesson. So like we've talked about in class, the large group lesson is where we introduce topics, where we get students interested, we take a peek into their prior knowledge about this topic, and then the small group lesson you would assume would come after the large group lesson that would dive deeper into that content to support what you have taught them in the large group lesson. So the large group lesson objective will be the lower level objective that you created for your Standards and Objectives project. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. I'm actually going to kind of just walk you through the example. I'm a person who 100% does better when I see an actual example of what it's supposed to look like. I apologize for my dogs playing with their toys in the background. And so I'm going to show you, this is the example that's in ReggieNet of the Standards and Objectives project. And then I'll show you how this aligns with the lesson plan. So I have the same students, small and large group lesson plans, who created this Standards and Objectives project. Okay, so you'll see that this student had this standard about, it's a kindergarten standard about modeling shapes in the world. So this was the prior knowledge and information. This was her breakdown into subtargets. This is the subtarget that she focused on for her objectives, her lower level objective, etc. Okay, so what I want you to recognize is that then when we look at the example that she created, or that I've included, that the same student created, you'll see that basically you're just cutting and pasting the standard and the lower level objective here. So again, going back, look at this, There's her standard, there's her lower level objective, which are identical to the standard and lower level objective here. Okay, so that's something that you won't have to recreate. That's information that you can just take straight from your standards and objectives assignment. You will need to give your lesson a title. You will know which grade level it's for because it will align with the standard that you have, that you used for your standard and objectives project. You can include your name here. I took it off because this was another student's paper. And how long you think the lesson will take. Remember that for, I think it was in week 2 when we were talking about the temporal environment and schedules, we talked about recommended time frames for different grade levels. So this student has used 20 minutes because we talked about large group lessons being no more than 15 minutes with a 5-minute debriefing, right? So that's why that time frame is there. So be sure to go back and look at that if you have a different grade level that you're doing your assignment for or your lesson plan for. The central focus is why this topic is important for students to learn, what they may have already learned about this topic, what they may continue to learn about this topic, and so on. So you will be creating this part and adding this. You don't have this anywhere else, right? So moving on, we start thinking about the assessments, all right? Last week we talked a lot about Bloom's taxonomy. So as you were putting together your lower and higher level objectives, you were asked in the Standards and Objectives project for your lower level objective, it to be one of the bottom 3 levels of Bloom's taxonomy. So either remember, understand, or apply. So here the student has said that the level of Bloom's that she is addressing in this objective is remember. Okay. Now we move on to formative and summative assessments. So for formative assessments, these are the things that we do as we go on, as we teach. So this student has thought through how she might check for understanding to see if the students are progressing well throughout this lesson. Remember, your formative assessments will guide your teaching and inform your teaching as you're teaching this specific lesson. So these are things that this student has said she would do to check for understanding while teaching the lesson. Okay, so these are all formative assessments. Now, when we get ready to do the summative assessment for your large group lesson plan, which aligns with your lower level lesson objective, you will be asked to do a checklist. Okay, so as we've just discussed in the presentation that I recorded earlier today, a checklist is a quick and easy way to gather information about a specific topic. So in your checklist, you should be including criteria that align with your lesson objectives. So this is summative, so you want to know at the end of your lesson, were students able to meet these different elements that were a part of your lesson objective. Okay, so this student has described this. She's also included an example of the checklist. I want you to include an example. This student went through and included like made up names for all of her students in her like hypothetical classroom or fake classroom. You can do that, but you don't have to include all of those different pieces. Right? The next section is knowledge of your students. Okay, so remember, this is for a fake classroom. So I know this can be sometimes confusing because you're like, wait, I don't know what my students know because I'm making this up for a group of students that doesn't exist, right? So what might help is to go to your standards and objectives assignment to look at this piece where you state what you would assume students would know about this particular standard that you're addressing in your lessons. So you can draw from this piece to write this information. All right. So when you're reading this and it says in our classroom there are 20 students, I have a student with ELL, autism, blah, blah, blah. This is all stuff that you will create, that you will develop, that you will make up. All right. So I know that can be confusing, but please ask me if you have questions about that. Based on the information that you include here, you will need to think about how you might differentiate your instruction and or provide accommodations for students who may have special learning needs or exceptional learning needs. When we think about accommodations tend to be more for individual learners, right? So if a student has an IEP or a 504 plan, we would need to develop specific ways that we would accommodate that individual student to ensure they could participate in the lesson. So here you're asked to describe at least 2 specific ways you would meet the needs of individual learners who may have unique learning needs. Again, this is all stuff that you are creating, making up. Above here is more related to differentiation. Differentiation is what we do to think about all the students being successful in the lesson. All right, so the last part in the knowledge or understanding of students is the resources and materials. So this is going to be where you'll include details related to all of the different things that a person would need to teach this lesson. You'll see here that it says, where can the sub find necessary resources in order to facilitate this lesson? It says that because you should always be designing your lessons so that someone else could come in and teach your lesson if you were not able to. All right, so you should always include enough detail in your lesson that somebody else, like a substitute teacher, your assistant teacher, whoever it might be, could pick up this plan and teach the lesson successfully. Okay, so that's why it says that there, the sub. So make sure everything's there and in enough detail. And finally, on page 5, we get to the steps in your lesson. You may be like, wow, what am I actually teaching? Well, this is where you are going to write out details about what you'll actually be doing. You can see here that this student wrote out, oops, sorry, my apologies, it is prime dog walking time on Sunday morning. So I apologize for the dogs in the background. So the first thing that you're going to include on both lesson plans, small group and large group, again, thinking large group is going to be with all students, small group is going to be with you leading a group of just 4 or 5 students, is going to be the hook. So how are you going to introduce this lesson? How are you going to get students interested in learning more? How are you going to communicate what you want students to learn from this lesson? All that happens at the beginning, the hook of the lesson. The introduction also includes a link, which is like, how are you going to get the students to move from the introduction, like how am I going to get students interested in this lesson, to the main point of your lesson or the main activities, which will be in the middle of your lesson plan. All right, so this student wrote more of a narrative. You can also do bullet points if that's easier for you. It's totally your preference. Up here, you're going to think about how much time would it take to do these 2 pieces. It shouldn't be very long, right? So 5 minutes is probably about right. Now the next part is where you're going to do most of your teaching. With large group, you have to keep in mind, this is probably, if you're in a kindergarten, 1st, 2nd grade classroom, going to be done with 20, 25 students. So you're going to be thinking about how you'll explicitly teach the students about whatever it is that your lesson is related to. So these are the steps that the teacher would use. And then when you're modeling, so the first is I do, so I show you what to do. And then we do, we work together. So this is guided practice. And then every large group lesson should have the I do, we do, you do, right? So I show you what to do. I give you opportunities to practice. That's the we do, or guided practice. And then you do is the independent practice, right? So then this is the opportunity for the students to try things out on their own. Finally, the last 5 or so minutes should be related to the wrap-up of your lesson. So conclusions, what did we learn today? What are kind of the takeaways? Sometimes in this wrap-up is where we'll do our summative assessments, right, to make sure that we have gathered information about whether students met the learning objectives or not. Okay. We also need to be thinking about next steps. So what will the students do in the small group activity to reinforce what they learned in this large group activity? What will they do the next day related to this particular topic, etc.? Thinking about transitions, we've talked about how challenging transitions can be. We want to be thinking about how we might transition students to the next lesson or the next thing that's going on in the activity for the day in the classroom. And then finally, every lesson should have kind of like a plan B, a what if. So activity extensions are things that you can include to think through what might happen if your technology doesn't work. What might happen if the lesson ends too quickly, if it takes too long, if I have to cut out parts of the lesson, what would I cut out? So those things would go into these 2 sections here. Okay, so potential problems and solutions, ways that you might extend the activity, and so on. So then everything, oops, I left my student's name on here. So then everything gets repeated. I did ask her if I could use them, by the way. So if anyone knows Hannah, you can say, oh, I saw your lesson. Then this gets sort of repeated in the small group lesson plan, right? But in small groups, what do we know? We dive deeper. We go deeper into the content because we're working with smaller groups of students. We also know that small group lessons can be longer than large group. So I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but it's very similar in terms of the standards the same. Remember, you're taking the higher level objective. So if you look at this higher level objective, it aligns with this, which is the higher level objective. All right. The part of Bloom's taxonomy, assessments, and so on. Something to keep in mind is that with your summative assessments for your small group lesson, you will be creating a rubric. So you'll see here the student includes a sample rubric. The knowledge of the students can be the same in your large and small group lesson, so you can use the same one in both. So that's something to keep in mind. In some cases, the accommodations and differentiation can be the same too, but not always. All right. So I hope that this is helpful. I hope that if you have questions, we'll talk more about this when we meet on February 21st. As always, with any of your assignments, you need to also make sure that, let me go back over here, that before you turn them in, you've checked the guidelines, you've done the checklist, the self-assessment to make sure that you've covered everything that needs to be included in the lesson. So just to wrap one more time, the draft, the optional draft opportunity is due February 26th for your lesson plans, and the final draft for your lesson plans is due on March the 5th. Thanks, everyone.